A mysterious visitor vanishes. But only after someone rewrites the guest book. Welcome to Enigma Obieto. I am your host, Chris. This growing circle of curious minds inspires me. Where in the world are you watching from? *Your voices shape this journey. I love reading each and every one. Let's begin. It was a warm September afternoon when the guests began to arrive at Greystone Hall, the ancestral home of Colonel Basil Arbuthnot. The occasion, a modest weekend gathering, was ostensibly in celebration of the Colonel's recent investiture into the Royal Horticultural Society, a distinction that delighted him far more than any military honour he'd ever received. The lawns had been clipped to perfection, the flower beds refreshed with early autumn dahlias, and in the drawing-room a tray of sherry glasses gleamed in the slanted golden light. Among the invited few were Lady Daphne Windermere, a distant cousin, with an acid tongue and a fondness for cardigans shaped like heirlooms, Mr. Quentin Price, an ambitious local solicitor with eyes too quick to judge, young Valerie Craig, a journalist from London and a guest of Daphne's, who seemed to find everything in the village charmingly quaint, including the people, and finally, the Reverend Thomas Everley, who managed to be both shy and intrusive in the same breath. They all arrived by motorcar, save for Miss Marple, who walked up the pebbled drive with her usual unhurried gait, her grey straw hat bobbing slightly with each step. She had received a last-minute invitation from the Colonel's sister, Mrs. Agatha Lytton, a firm believer in good breeding and firm sponge cake, Miss Marple, who had once helped Agatha identify a missing silver sugar tongue that turned out to be in her hat box all along, had earned her trust and her curiosity. Inside the house, preparations were well underway. The billiards room, rarely used and still faintly smelling of tobacco from the Colonel's younger days, had been polished and aired out. An ornate buffet of smoked salmon, cold roast beef, and trifles was laid out for later. Conversations swirled as the guests trickled in, all smiles and pleasantries, though behind every smile was a flicker of calculation. Valerie Craig, for one, seemed far too interested in the dusty family portraits that lined the upper corridor. She lingered there longer than politeness required, and her notebook appeared once or twice when she thought no one was looking. "I dare say she's sniffing for scandal," Lady Daphne muttered to Miss Marple as they shared a mild cup of Earl Grey on the terrace. These modern girls, always itching for gossip columns and typewriters. One hopes she finds nothing here, though. One never knows. Miss Marple murmured something agreeable, but her pale blue eyes had already wandered thoughtfully toward the billiards room, where the Colonel and Mr. Price had disappeared 10 minutes earlier for what they called a friendly wager. By evening, the party had swelled with more local guests, among them Dr. Lennox, the village physician, Iris Denby, the Colonel's quiet, long-serving housekeeper, and young Martin Lytton, Agatha's song, recently returned from a failed attempt at a banking career in the city. Dinner was uneventful, if slightly stilted. Talk of chrysanthemums and cricket gave way to minor disagreements over inheritance taxes, and Valerie Craig's pointed questions about the history of Greystone Hall were met with polite evasions. Afterward, the gentlemen retired some reluctantly to the billiards room, while the ladies enjoyed port in the drawing-room. It was nearly 11 when the first scream rang out high and sharp, echoing down the stone corridor like a blade. Iris Denby stood frozen in the doorway of the billiards room, her hands trembling. "Colonel Arbuthnot," she whispered. "He's dead." Guests came rushing. Miss Marple did not. She stood quietly near the stairwell, watching as chaos unfurled like a well-rehearsed play. A brandy glass lay shattered on the carpet. The Colonel slumped in a leather armchair, eyes staring, jaw clenched unnaturally. A half-played game of billiards sat unfinished behind him. No blood, no weapon in sight, only silence, and the slow, precise ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Later, As the village constable was summoned and the guests murmured in clutches about the shock, Miss Marple leaned in close to Agatha Lytton and asked gently, "My dear, did Basil ever suffer from heart trouble?" "No," said Agatha, her face pale with confusion. "Not a day in his life." Miss Marple nodded slowly. She had already begun to suspect that someone in the house was playing a very dangerous game, and that th. true match had only just begun. By morning, the news had spread through the village of Chipping Radford with the ruthless speed and accuracy of a well-aimed dart. Colonel Arbuthnot, pillar of the community, keeper of roses, veteran of India, and not above a little harmless gossip himself, was dead, found lifeless in the very room where he had once taught his nephew how to play snooker and scolded the gardener for cracking a cue stick. The billiards room, once a quiet symbol of tradition, was now whispered about with wide eyes and lowered voices. At the High Street bakery, Mrs. Finch, who claimed to have once danced with the Colonel at the Harvest Ball of 1931, informed her queue of regulars that it must have been the smoked salmon. "Fish is treacherous if not kept properly chilled. Ask anyone," she said, nodding solemnly as she handed over a sticky Chelsea bun. "He always did love that smoked salmon. Ate it too quickly, I'd wager." Across the street at the greengrocer's, young Maisie Thorne was certain it was poison arsenic or something romantic like that, and speculated loudly on who might have administered it. "Probably the journalist, that pretty one with the sharp heels. She's not from here, you see." At the post office, Mr. Tilly, sorting his mail behind the glass screen, declared it was a stroke. Plain and simple. That's what takes 'em at that age. 1 minute you're potting a red, next you're gone, like a candle snuffed out. The theories, growing in number and absurdity, made their way up the hill to St. Mary Mead, where Miss Marple sat in the quiet comfort of her parlour, a teacup balanced in one hand and a well-worn notebook in the other. She was not one to write down conclusions that came much later, but rather patterns, rhythms, tiny inconsistencies in the words people used or didn't use. She had already noted the brandy glass, the position of the chair, the way Iris Denby's voice trembled on the word dead but steadied curiously when she described the billiards room, and above all, the curious fact that no one, not even the doctor who later pronounced the death, had offered a satisfactory explanation for what exactly had killed Colonel Arbuthnot. The village constable, Mr. Greaves, was doing his best to look authoritative as he made inquiries. A young man with more enthusiasm than experience, he interviewed the guests still at Greystone Hall, notepad in hand and uniform slightly askew. He had already concluded that natural causes seemed most likely, although he admitted privately to Miss Marple at one point that the man's eyes looked wide, somehow, like he was afraid. "Fear can do strange things," Miss Marple replied gently, adjusting her gloves, "but it rarely leaves a room so tidy." Meanwhile, the guests had been advised to remain at the hall for the time being, though no one quite said why. The body had been removed in the early hours, after the doctor confirmed death and made a vague comment about further tests, just in case. The police were waiting on a pathologist from nearby Basington. That, at least, gave Miss Marple time. In the drawing-room, breakfast was subdued. No one touched the eggs. Valley Craig, despite appearing the most composed, wore the same blouse from the night before and was furiously scribbling in a leather-bound notebook. Between sips of lukewarm tea, "It's simply dreadful," said Lady Daphne Windermere, breaking a scone with a surprisingly firm hand. "But hardly unexpected, don't you think? Basil's temper could frighten a horse, and he never did have a delicate heart." "No," said Mrs. Lytton, her voice cool and unflinching, "he had a strong heart." "That's what makes it so strange." Valerie looked up, pen pausing in midair. "Did anyone see him arguing with someone that evening?" Before it happened, there was a small, Awkward silence. Martin Lytton cleared his throat. Well, he and Mr. Price seemed to have a bit of a row. Something about land rights. Uncle Basil was never fond of solicitors, saying they were all born meddling. Quentin Price isn't born meddling. Daphne cut in sharply. He trained for it. There's a difference. In the corner, Miss Marple, who had been darning a small tear in her cardigan, looked up and said, "How interesting. I wonder what sort of land could cause such a quarrel in these parts. An old parcel near the woods," Martin said, "came up in a boundary dispute. Price said he'd found new maps, or something." Uncle didn't like being corrected, especially not by someone who once misquoted Keats at dinner. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, pride in one's knowledge can be a dangerous thing, even more so when someone calls it into question. Shortly after breakfast, the Reverend asked to walk Miss Marple to the churchyard, an odd request, but one she obliged with good grace. On their way, he spoke in halting tones about the Colonel's legacy, the spiritual questions of sudden death, and whether sin leaves echoes. Iris Denby came to church every Sunday. "Yet I always had the feeling she was afraid," he murmured, "not of God, mind you, but of someone." Miss Marple nodded politely, her mind already weaving threads. By the time they reached the iron gate of the churchyard, she had asked questions he hadn't expected. "Do you recall if Colonel Arbuthnot had recently changed his will?" she asked softly. The Reverend blinked. "Well, yes, about 3 weeks ago. In fact, I witnessed it. He made rather a show of saying he didn't want scavengers picking over what's his, though I never asked who he meant." Miss Marple turned to face the moss-covered stones. People rarely mean just one person when they say something like that. It's almost always a warning. By midday, Miss Marple returned to Greystone Hall, where Quentin Price was pacing near the library window, cigarette twitching in his fingers. "Terrible business," he said briskly. "Of course, I told Basil to keep his temper in check, but the man wouldn't listen." "Did he threaten you?" Miss Marple asked mildly, inspecting a nearby vase of withering peonies. Price gave a short laugh. "Colonel Arbuthnot threatened me? No. He was angry, yes, but not violent. He said something about shadows on the family name. Whatever that means, I told him a little transparency would help. Families cling to secrets like lifeboats, Miss Marple. But sometimes it's the weight of those secrets that sinks the ship." "Indeed," said Miss Marple, fingering a small embroidered doily, "and some secrets are like billiard balls. They don't move until struck." That evening, as the guests retired to their rooms and the murmurs quieted, Miss Marple sat by the fireplace, knitting slowly, her eyes half lowered but alert. She thought about the expression on Iris Denby's face, the precise moment the body was found, the brandy glass, and the map, always the map. Someone at Greystone Hall had struck a very deliberate shot. And while the village whispered itself hoarse with wild theories, Miss Marple was beginning to hear the silence between the words. It was always there where the truth liked to hide. The day after the Colonel's death was one of cautious civility. At Greystone Hall, the guests remained under polite house arrest, encouraged not to depart until the coroner's report arrived and until Chief Inspector Cray from the County Constabulary had conducted or formal interviews. The inspector was due that afternoon, but until then, the house carried the weight of waiting that slow, suspended atmosphere peculiar to English country homes touched by misfortune. Miss Marple, having taken a modest breakfast of buttered toast and marmalade in her room, emerged dressed in lavender and grey, her gloves perfectly matched to her hat. She passed the long window that overlooked the garden and paused for a moment, observing Lady Daphne whispering to Martin Lytton beneath the cedar tree. They parted quickly when they noticed her gaze, and Miss Marple continued on as though she'd merely been admiring the begonias. In the drawing-room, the air was stale with tension and furniture polish. Valerie Craig sat alone on the edge of a chaise, flipping through a heavy volume from the Greystone Library. She didn't look up as Miss Marple entered, but spoke without preamble. "He was murdered, you know." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Oh, that's quite a strong declaration, Miss Craig." Valerie closed the book with care. "It doesn't take a detective." The brandy glass was moved. I noticed it when I came in after the constable, and the window latch was broken. Not newly broken, but someone had made a habit of sneaking in or out of that room. You don't get that sort of damage from a breeze. Miss Marple approached the armchair near the hearth and settled into it with the grace of someone unbothered by confrontation. "And what do you suppose is the motive, if I may ask?" Valerie leaned forward. "Secrets, always secrets. People think the truth can stay buried forever in a place like this. But it always finds a crack to crawl through." Miss Marple gave a soft sigh. "It's often the motive, yes, though the truth is sometimes far less dramatic than the things people invent to cover it." She turned her head slightly as Quentin Price entered the room, brisk and polished, yet visibly uncomfortable to find the two women engaged. "Good morning, ladies. I hope we're not descending into armchair criminology." He gave a thin smile. "Inspector Cray is due shortly. Let's leave the detection to those with badges." Valerie rose with a flash of irritation. "Some of us care what really happened, Mr. Price. Some of us," he returned, "also have reputations to consider. This is still a house of mourning." Miss Marple said nothing, though her knitting needles, which had appeared as if by magic, began to click softly. By noon, Chief Inspector Cray had arrived, a square-shouldered man with thick eyebrows and a voice like a cracked kettle. He interviewed the guests one by one in the Colonel's study, beginning with Iris Denby. Miss Marple, of course, was not present for the interviews, but she was acquainted with enough police methodology to guess how they would go. Iris, rattled and withdrawn, would give short answers. Lady Daphne would offer unsolicited speculation and faint with theatrical flair if pushed too hard. Martin Lytton would try too hard to seem helpful, and Valerie Craig would either clash with the inspector or dazzle him. By early afternoon, the inspector emerged with a furrowed brow and a thin stack of notes. He declined to make any public statements, but his muttered conversations with Constable Greaves in the hallway were not as quiet as he thought. Miss Marple overheard just enough to be concerned. "No trace of poison," Cray was saying. Hart gave out. "Yes, but there's more. Something unnatural in the stiffness and the position of the hands, like he was reaching for something." Greaves hesitated. "Could he have been holding something, or been given something?" Cray replied. "Something that left no trace, that night, over a quiet supper of cold ham and cucumber salad." The household began to fray at the edges. Lady Daphne drank more than usual, murmuring about her need to return to her cat in London. Quentin Price insisted on reviewing a letter he claimed the Colonel had meant to sign, and Martin Lytton, pale and increasingly nervous, excused himself early, claiming a headache. Miss Marple found herself sharing the sitting room with Iris Denby. The housekeeper had been largely invisible since the death, drifting through hallways and wiping surfaces already clean, but now she sat on the edge of a hard chair, hands folded in her lap, eyes lowered. "Do you mind if I ask you something, Iris?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle. The housekeeper flinched slightly, but nodded. "You said you found the Colonel after hearing a noise. What sort of noise was it?" Iris hesitated. "It wasn't a noise, exactly. More of a feeling. Like something wasn't right. I was just passing by. The door was open, and he looked so still. And the brandy glass. I didn't touch it." Miss Marple gave a small smile. "I didn't ask if you had." Silence stretched between them. Then Iris added, in a near whisper, "I think he knew something was coming. The day before, he asked me to bring out the safe key." The one hidden behind the clock face. He never asks for it unless it's serious. What did he take from the safe? I don't know. He was alone with it. Miss Marple nodded and let the silence settle again. Sometimes she had learned the best way to get people to speak was to let them sit with what they were afraid to say. Iris looked up. He wasn't a cruel man, but he had enemies, old ones. That night, as the rest of the house went still, Miss Marple stood by the window of her room, looking out over the moonlit lawn. A shadow moved near the cedar tree to tall to be Iris. To lean to be Quentin, Valerie, perhaps, or Martin, someone, was pacing, thinking, or planning. Miss Marple pulled the curtain closed and turned back to her room. She thought again of the Colonel's safety, of the revised will, of the latch on the window. Of the brandy, there had been no trace of poison. But then not all poisons left a mark. Some poisons were words, others, secrets withheld at the precise moment they mattered most, and some were given with a smile and a glass raised in silent farewell by the next morning. The atmosphere in Greystone Hall had taken on the taut, glinting sharpness of a well-polished knife. No one said the word suspect aloud, but it hovered invisibly above every conversation like a fine mist. The guests avoided one another in the corridors, retreating to drawing rooms and stairwells with murmured excuses. Every door closed a little more firmly. Every glance carried an unspoken question. Chief Inspector Crow returned just after breakfast, his manner brusque and his eyes darker than before. He had with him a slim, sealed envelope bearing the results from the preliminary toxicology report. Miss Marple, seated near the hallway bureau rearranging a vase of Browning chrysanthemums, didn't need to read it to know what it said. No arsenic, no cyanide, no opiates, nothing conclusive, and yet the Colonel was dead. Natural causes, they call it, Cray said dryly to Constable Greaves, unaware that his voice carried down the hallway. But something's wrong. You don't just slump back in a chair mid-sentence unless something stops you, and Basil Arbuthnot wasn't the sort of man to be caught off guard. The first real suspicion fell, rather conveniently, on Quentin Price. It was he who had last been seen with the Colonel that evening sharing a drink, discussing the contested land parcel near the edge of the woods. Price had also spoken of a legal disagreement, which now appeared to be rather more bitter than previously admitted. There was tension, certainly, Quentin conceded when pressed by Cray later that morning, but not violence. Basil may have been obstinate, but we always found common ground eventually. He didn't like my advice, that's true, but that's hardly murder, is it? Miss Marple, who was quietly mending a lace cuff in the corner of the library while this exchange occurred, said nothing. But her eyes remained fixed on Quentin's. Hands smooth, well manicured, not a trace of tremor, and yet one fingernail was recently trimmed much shorter than the others. A curious detail, a sign of haste, perhaps. Later, when Cray joined the household for tea, he laid out his early conclusions in a tone meant to sound informal, though it was anything but. There are 3 possibilities, he said, stirring his cup without interest. 1, natural death, a heart suddenly overwhelmed. 2, accident, perhaps a reaction to something he drank, or a fall we haven't accounted for. And 3, and I say this with great reluctance, foul play, a deliberate act, though with no traceable method. The room was very still. The grandfather clock ticked. With a nerving clarity, Lady Daphne was the first to break the silence. Well, if you're looking for motivation, you needn't go further than Quentin. Basil loathed him, thought he was an interfering, arrogant prig. Said so at dinner not a week ago. Quentin stiffened but did not respond. Martin Lytton cleared his throat. That's a bit unfair. Daphne, Uncle Basil loathed a great many people. He loathed the postmaster for shortening his pension cheque once. Yes, Daphne said crisply, but the postmaster didn't stand to gain from his death. That, at last, made Quentin speak. I did not gain from his death. In fact, I lost a lucrative retainer, and may I remind you that I didn't inherit a single acre of his land, so unless we're tossing around theories based on dislike, I suggest we examine who did benefit. Miss Marple, who had remained silent, glanced up from her knitting. Well, she said mildly, perhaps we should also consider who feared Basil most. That can be a powerful motive too. Especially if one's secrets were at risk of being revealed. The room seemed to contract slightly. At her words, later, after the tea had cooled and the guests dispersed, Inspector Cray asked Miss Marple to join him in the study. You've a keen way with people, Miss Marple. I won't deny it. Tell me, who do you suspect? She smiled gently. Oh, I never suspect anyone. That's for young men in uniforms. I merely observe what people say when they're not speaking, and what they avoid when they do. Cray grunted. That's no help to me. Oh, I believe it will be, in time. He leaned against the desk. What about Martin Lytton? The Colonel's nephew. Stopped talking to him last month. Some sort of quarrel, family money, I expect. Yes, miss. Marple said slowly. But Martin is not a cruel young man, nervous, yes, but not calculating. If he was involved, it would be because someone made him afraid. She turned to the desk, where an envelope sat partially hidden beneath a ledger. May I? She asked. Cray nodded. Miss Marple lifted the envelope and slid out a single folded page. It was a typed draft of the Colonel's revised will unsigned. The version where a sizable sum had been redirected from Martin to a trust managed by Iris Denby. Ah, she murmured. Cray looked puzzled. Why give it to the housekeeper? Iris knew something. Miss Marple said, or perhaps she simply saw something. Basil was fond of her loyalty, but it seems he never got round to signing this copy. A soft knock interrupted them. Iris herself stood in the doorway. Begging your pardon. There's someone at the gate asking to speak with the inspector. A woman. Says she's the Colonel's former companion from France. Cray looked up. Another one. Miss Marple rose slowly. France, you say? My, that wasn't mentioned at supper. When Cray left to investigate, Miss Marple remained behind, alone in the study. She turned toward the safe behind the clock and looked at it carefully. The hands on the clock were slightly off, 13 minutes behind. That, too, was unlike Basil. He had always prized punctuality. It struck her then that the timing of death might not have been as simple as assumed, that perhaps the brandy wasn't meant to kill, but to distract. Or worse, to deliver something only when it was too late to resist. Outside, footsteps approached. A new player had entered the scene. Miss Marple folded her knitting quietly and stood. The pieces were not yet in place, but the board was beginning to take shape. Somewhere, she felt, someone had made a move too soon, and in doing so, had left their king exposed. The woman at the gate introduced herself as Madame Lucienne Vervain, a poised figure in her early 50s, wrapped in dove-grey silk with gloves to match and a scent of violet lingering in her wake. Her arrival stirred the house like a sudden wind sweeping through closed curtains. Even before she stepped inside, the mere sound of her name rippled across Greystone Hall like a shiver of recognition, though no one admitted to knowing her. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the drawing-room, recognized the French grace immediately. It was not the self-conscious elegance of London society, but something more studied, more deliberate. Every movement was calculated to neither shock nor appear demure. It was the kind of manner, Miss Marple thought, that one develops only when one has lived long with secrets. Inspector Cray received her formally in the library. The other guests, pretending not to listen, lingered conspicuously in adjacent rooms. With books held upside down and teacups clutched in still hands, Lady Daphne pretended to inspect a vase of lilies for wilting, while Valerie Craig remained near the doorway with a notebook concealed behind a copy of Country Life, You New Colonel, Arbuthnot. Cray asked, his tone professional but shaded with suspicion. Once, Lucian replied, her accent smooth and unmistakable. A long time ago, in Biarritz, before the war, we were close. He wrote to me last month, asked me to come. What for? I do not know precisely, she said with a shrug of her narrow shoulders. He said he had made changes, that he wanted to see me one last time to give me something. But when I arrived, I was told he had died. Cray exchanged a glance with Miss Marple, who stood behind the desk, her expression unreadable. And did he give you anything? The inspector asked. No, he died before I arrived. Miss Marple, ever soft-voiced, interrupted gently. But surely, Madame Vervain, you did not travel all the way from Biarritz merely on a vague promise. He must have been quite specific in his letter. Lucian turned. He said only that there was something I had once given him, long ago, that he had kept it, and that he no longer wished to. Miss Marple's fingers paused on her handbag clasp. How curious, sentimental items are rarely relinquished voluntarily, unless they've become dangerous. Lucian's eyes flickered, but she said nothing more. That evening, Miss Marple asked Iris Denby whether the Colonel had kept any private possessions in the billiards room. At first, the housekeeper shook her head, then paused. There was one thing. She said, a small wooden box, very old, he kept it in the bottom drawer of the sideboard, behind the billiard chalk. Said it was just knick-knacks, but he was protective of it. May I see it? Iris hesitated. I suppose it's still there. The police didn't take it. In the dim light of the billiards room, Miss Marple opened the sideboard drawer and gently lifted the box no bigger than a jewellery case, with brass hinges worn smooth. The lock had no key, but Miss Marple, who had once untangled a smuggling scheme hidden within a bishop's service, knew that where locks existed, old spoons often helped. Inside were a few faded letters, some tied in blue ribbon, and a chess piece, a black knight, carved of bone, with a chip in its base. She read only the top letter. It was in French. Poor toy, always for you. If they ever find out what we did. Miss Marple closed the box slowly and replaced it as she found it. The clues were not yet ready to be revealed. But one thing was clear. The Colonel had been carrying a burden, one perhaps shared with Madame Vervain. Later, as the household retired to bed, Miss Marple stepped out into the moonlit corridor and stood before the billiards room again. Something bothered her, something about the game left unfinished. The table, untouched since the night of the death, still bore Teacups resting askew, and 3 balls in irregular placement. She turned on the light and examined the table. A red ball had rolled slightly off-centre, near the top corner pocket. The black ball, used rarely in casual play, sat perfectly still near the left cushion. She bent low, eyes narrowed. On the side of the cue stick closest to the Colonel's chair, she saw something that most would not have noticed, a faint smudge of powder near the handle, grey, almost silvery. Not chalk, something finer. Carefully, she took out a handkerchief and dabbed at the smudge. When she held the cloth to the light, it sparkled faintly. Later, in her room, she folded the cloth neatly and placed it in her satchel. The next morning, the house awoke to a surprising development. Quentin Price had departed. No note, no announcement, just a single statement made to Martin Lytton. I've been made a scapegoat long enough. Inspector Cray was furious. We told him not to leave. He knew we hadn't cleared anyone. Miss Marple, however, remained unbothered. I rather think, she said, he's gone not to hide, but to retrieve something. He was much to com yesterday, wouldn't you say? That kind of com usually means one believes they have the upper hand or the missing piece. As the day wore on, suspicion shifted once more. Lady Daphne accused Valerie of manipulation. Valerie accused Martin of cowardice. Iris said little but glanced often at Lucian. who remained cool and untouched by the drama. Miss Marple, however, busied herself in the garden. Among the trimmed hedges, she found exactly what she had suspected, a narrow path leading from the billiards room window to the tool shed. The earth was soft with recent rain, and though many prints had been blurred, one set stood out a narrow heel, French in design. But more curious was what she found behind the shed, a discarded envelope, rain-damp and torn. Inside was a single playing card, the Queen of Spades folded once, with a smear of what looked like oil across its face, a message, perhaps, or a warning. Miss Marple pocketed it and walked back to the house. The truth, she felt, was no longer far. But the key to unlocking it would not be found in obvious motives or the arguments spoken aloud. It would lie instead in a single moment, a gesture overlooked, a thing once given, and then taken back, and when that moment revealed itself, the final act would begin. It was shortly after luncheon when the mood in Greystone Hall shifted once more, this time, from brittle unease to something far more volatile. The air had grown heavier, the clouds above threatening rain, and within the house, long-held tensions, suppressed for the sake of civility, began to break their bindings. The disappearance of Quentin Price that morning had rattled more than just Inspector Cray. It had left a silence in its wake, and in that silence, voices grew louder, secrets pressed to the surface, like bruises rising beneath pale skin. Miss Marple sat in the small morning room, overlooking the east lawn, where Martin Lytton stood smoking with uncharacteristic urgency, pacing the grass in short, uneven strides. She had noticed it before his growing discomfort, but now it seemed to pulse visibly beneath his collar. "Your hands are shaking, dear boy," she said gently when he came in to retrieve a newspaper he didn't need. Martin was startled. "Am I? It's just this business." "Awful, isn't it? Uncle Basil, dead, and now." Price vanished like a thief in the night. Miss Marple gave a small, sympathetic nod. It's a great deal to take in, especially when one feels caught between grief and guilt, though not necessarily guilt for the crime. "You understand, but perhaps for something not said or done." Martin looked at her, his expression stricken. "You think I'm hiding something. No, dear, I know you're hiding something. But I dare say it's not what people might assume. Wouldn't it be easier, just a little, to tell someone?" He sat slowly, lowering himself into the armchair like a man much older than his years. "I hated the arguments," he said after a long pause. "Uncle Basil and Quentin fought all the time, and I was always in the middle. Basil wanted me to manage the estate. Quentin thought I should liquidate it. They both said they had my best interests at heart, but it always felt like a war fought over me. And did Basil revise his will in your favour?" Martin shook his head. "That's the thing. He didn't. He called me weak, said I lacked backbone. After our last argument, he said he was changing everything. I thought it was a threat, but maybe he meant it." Miss Marple nodded, absorbing every word. "I wanted to tell the inspector," Martin added, "but I panicked, and now with Quentin gone, I'll look even more suspicious." "Not to everyone, Miss Marple said kindly, "only to those who lack imagination." At that moment, Valerie Craig appeared in the doorway, her eyes unusually sharp, her expression unreadable. "Miss Marple," she said slowly, "you might want to come to the library. Lady Daphne and Madame Vervain are having a, shall we say, spirited exchange." When Miss Marple arrived, the scene was already unfolding like a stage play. Lady Daphne, cheeks flushed, stood with one gloved hand gripping the back of a velvet armchair. Madame Vervain remained seated, graceful and composed, but her eyes glinted like steel. "I knew it," Daphne was saying, "the moment I saw you slink through that gate like some lavender-scented ghost. You were always in the shadows, weren't you? Lurking just behind Basil's letters, in his daydreams, in his regrets." You poisoned his mind, and now he's dead. Lucian did not rise. Jealousy does not suit you. Lady Windermere, don't patronize me. Lucian, you think we didn't know about Biarritz? About your little arrangement with Basil, he called. You his muse, but you were more like a phantoma woman who appeared when it pleased her and disappeared when it became inconvenient. You are mistaken. Lucian said evenly, I cared for Basil. Deeply. But he belonged to England. I was never going to be part of this life. Miss Marple stepped forward softly. Did Colonel Arbuthnot ever speak of Lucian in the years after the war, Lady Daphne? Daphne turned, startled. Only once. He said some memories were better left abroad. Did he say that with sorrow or with anger? Daphne's mouth tightened. He said it with pain. There was silence. Madame Vervain slowly rose, smoothing the silk of her dress. We shared something, but it was long ago. And when I received his letter when he asked me to come, I feared he had uncovered something from the past, something that might harm us both. Miss Marple regarded her carefully. You mean the letters? Lucian blinked. What letters? The ones in the wooden box, tucked behind the billiard chalk. You hadn't known he kept them? Lucian looked genuinely shaken. No, I thought he burned them years ago. Miss Marple's voice remained soft. He kept more than letters. A chess piece, a queen of spades, folded into a card envelope. And he'd made an appointment with the solicitor to revise his will again, likely after your visit. That meeting never happened. Lady Daphne scoffed. Do you expect us to believe that Basil, after all this time, was still pining for a woman who left him? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, I think Basil kept those letters not because he missed her, but because they held power, and secrets are like heirlooms, dangerous. Especially when inherited unexpectedly, outside. Thunder rolled gently in the distance. The storm was drawing nearer. Later that evening, Miss Marple walked once more to the billiards room. This time, she was not alone. Iris Denby waited for her there, as arranged by a simple message left on the breakfast tray. You said you remembered something, Miss Marple. Prompted gently, Iris looked pale, the lines of her face deeper than usual. I'd forgotten, or made myself forget. The night he died there was an argument, not just with Mr. Price. There was someone else, a woman. I didn't see her face, but I heard her voice. I thought it might have been Lady Daphne at first, but it was colder, foreign, maybe. Lucian, Iris nodded. They spoke in hushed tones. But I caught something about proof and danger. Then she left through the side door. Basil poured a drink, sat down, and stared at the chessboard like it held an answer. Miss Marple absorbed this in silence. A few minutes later, I heard a thud. When I came in, he was gone. The old clock in the hallway struck 10. Thank you, Iris, Miss Marple said softly. Sometimes truth only needs a single seam to unravel, and she knew then, with a quiet certainty, that what had killed Colonel Arbuthnot was not rage or betrayal, or even love. It was scary, fear that something long buried would rise again, and someone, somewhere in that house, had ensured it never would. The storm broke just after midnight. Thunder rolled low and heavy across the hills beyond Chipping Radford, and by the time the first sheets of rain struck the windows of Greystone Hall, most of its guests were lying awake, listening. The rain rattled the panes with a desperate energy, as though the night itself were trying to shake loose the secrets within those stone walls. Miss Marple, however, was already up. She had taken to keeping vigil during such moments when the world was hushed by weather, and the human heart revealed itself in small, unguarded acts. She sat by the window with a blanket draped over her, knees knitting needles still, her eyes on the far end of the garden. It was there, in a flash of lightning, that she saw movement, a figure, dark and hunched, slipping across the lawn toward the cedar tree. Not Iris, the stride was too brisk, not Martin, either. Someone smaller, swifter. It was the second time she'd noticed this shape in the night. Miss Marple rose, fastened her shawl, and with an umbrella in one hand and a small torch in the other, made her way quietly down the corridor, past the silent billiards room, and out through the side door. The storm greeted her with a slap of cold rain, and within moments her shoes were soaked, but her eyes remained fixed on the distant figure, now at the edge of the garden. Crouching near the tool shed, she moved cautiously, her steps softened by the grass. When she reached the cedar tree, she paused beneath its cover, close enough now to recognize the glint of a metallic torch light. The figure turned, Valerie Craig, soaked to the skin, her trench coat clinging to her. The young journalist looked up with wide eyes and no pretense of surprise. "I thought it might be you," Valerie said over the rain. "You have a habit of appearing just when someone thinks they're alone." Miss Marple stepped closer. "And you, my dear, have a habit of not being where you're expected. Might one ask why? You're crouched beside the shed in a storm at 1 in the morning." Valerie stood, brushing mud from her knees. "I was looking for something," she said plainly. "Something I think someone else hid here the night the Colonel died." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And what would that be?" "A chess piece, the White Queen." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Valerie continued, "I found the Black Knight earlier. You did too, I expect, but there's always a pair in these games, isn't there? Basil wrote about it in one of the letters I saw in his box. He said he'd kept both the knight and the queen as a reminder of a mistake, or maybe a promise, and you believe one is out here." "I don't just believe it," Valerie said, stepping aside. "I found it." From beneath a loose stone behind the shed, she retrieved a small parcel, wrapped in oilcloth. Inside, resting delicately in her palm, was a carved ivory queen, aged, cracked near the crown, but unmistakably exquisite. Miss Marple regarded it for a long moment. "I suppose now would be the time to ask how you knew to look here." Valerie's voice softened. "Because I knew him. Not the version you all saw, the colonel with the medals and the roses. I knew the man who came to Paris in the off-season. The man who paid in cash and never left his real name. He was looking for someone or something, and when he didn't find it, he found me." Miss Marple didn't speak, so Valerie continued. "I was 22. He was older, generous, and full of regret. He told me once that everything he'd loved had either died or been lost because of a lie. He said the queen always fell first, and the knight could never save her in time, and you came to Greystone hoping to learn the rest of that story." "No," Valerie said quietly. "I came because I think someone wanted him silenced. And I want to know why." They stood there in silence as the rain softened to a drizzle. When they returned to the house, Miss Marple took the chess piece and wrapped it in a clean handkerchief. "You should rest," she said to Valerie. "Tomorrow will bring more questions." But sleep was not what awaited them. At dawn, a scream shattered the morning. Iris Denby had gone to prepare the breakfast sideboard and found the pantry door ajar. Inside, Quentin Price stood hunched and trembling, his face pale and slick with sweat. "I couldn't get in," he muttered, barely coherent. "The gates were locked. I came back through the fields. I've been hiding. Cray, summoned within the hour, wasted no time." "You left in the middle of an open investigation, Mr. Price. That looks rather damning." "I was being watched," Quentin snapped. "Someone was following me when I left. I don't know who, but I thought it was safer to disappear. I wasn't running from guilt. I was running from whoever killed Basil. And where were you last night?" "In the woods near the stone well. I built a fire, waited until it was quiet again, and then I came back." Miss Marple, observing from the side, asked one question: "Why not go to the police?" Quentin hesitated. "Because I thought I'd be the next." Inspector Cray crossed his arms. "Next to die?" "No," Quentin whispered. "Next to be framed." It was late morning when Martin, pale and drawn, Stumbled into the library holding a letter. It slipped under my door. He said hoarsely, no name, just this. He handed it to Cray. It read, the Queen was never lost, only buried. Find her, and you'll find the truth. Miss Marple turned to the window, where the rain had stopped and the light had changed. The air smelled of damp soil and secrets unearthed. We've been looking at this all wrong, she said softly. The motive is not money, not revenge, it's preservation. Someone has spent years hiding the truth and they've killed to keep it buried. Cray frowned. Truth about what? Miss Marple looked at him with those calm, pale blue eyes. About what happened in Biarritz, about to chess pieces. I love that. Couldn't survive a war, and a secret that was never meant to return to England. There was silence, and then, from the hall, Valeri's voice echoed gently. I think it's time we asked who the Queen really was. And for the first time since the Colonel's death, everyone in Greystone Hall understood they weren't playing billiards anymore, they were playing chess. The morning light returned with a strange kind of clarity, as if the storm had washed away not only the grime from the leaded windows of Greystone Hall, but the layers of decorum that had masked deeper truths. The house felt quieter now, not calm, but watchful. Suspicion no longer passed in whispers. It sat openly at the breakfast table, Miss Marple, who had taken her morning tea in the corner of the conservatory, noted the subtle rearrangement of the guests. Valet Craig now kept to herself. Through her eyes followed everyone with the wary alertness of a cat among dogs. Martin Lytton hovered at the edges of each room, shoulders hunched, speaking only when spoken to. Lucienne Vervain, elegantly composed as ever, had resumed her embroidery, though her stitches were less precise than they had been the day before, and Quentin Price, now partially dried and reintroduced to the house, moved like a man still waiting for someone to place a hand on his shoulder and escort him back into the shadows. Only Lady Daphne seemed unchanged, though Miss Marple found this the most telling detail of all. At 11:30, Miss Marple asked for a small tray of tea to be brought to the drawing-room. She arranged for chairs in a semicircle and placed the chessboard, retrieved from the billiards room, in the centre table. With the Black Knight and White Queen now reunited, the board gleamed with a quiet menace. She then sent word through Iris to request the presence of Lucienne, Valerie, Martin, and Daphne. When the four arrived, some curious, some reluctant Miss Marple was already seated, her hands resting on the armrests of a high-back chair. I've invited you here, she said gently, not for accusations, but for understanding. A man is dead. He died, not in a fit of rage or by cruel happenstance, but because a story, long buried, was pulled to the surface. It is that story, I believe, which holds the key. Lucienne's eyes narrowed. You mean the letters? Yes, Miss Marple nodded. But also the people behind them. She gestured to the chessboard. The Colonel kept these as symbols. A knight and a queen. They were not merely tokens of sentiment. They represented roles he believed he had played or failed to play in something deeply regrettable. He believed himself the knight, and the woman he had failed, the queen. Valeri's voice broke the stillness. Was it you? She asked Lucienne. Were you the queen? Lucienne's gaze did not waver. No, I was the past he wanted to forget, not the one he feared. And yet, Miss Marple interjected, the letters to you were not fearful, but tender. It's the ones he wrote later to himself, in his diary, that changed in tone. He referred to the danger of the Queen returning. That doesn't sound like romantic anguish. It sounds like a threat. Lady Daphne laughed, brittle and sharp. Are we to believe a chess metaphor proves murder? No, Miss Marple said, but it reveals a motive. The Colonel had discovered something, or someone. The Queen was no longer symbolic. She was very real and had returned. Her eyes rested now on Lady Daphne. You visited him the evening before his death, didn't you? Daphne stiffened. Certainly not. I was in my room, and everyone can confirm it. Iris cannot, Miss Marple said calmly. She saw a woman leaving through the side door that evening. She heard voices not loud, but urgent. The shape, she said, could have been yours. But it wasn't Lucian's. The gate didn't match. Daphne's hands clenched on her lap. This is absurd. Miss Marple continued, her voice unwavering. You weren't always his cousin, were you? A stunned silence followed. Martin turned slowly. What does that mean? Miss Marple addressed him gently. Lady Daphne Windermere, or rather, Daphne Green, as she was once known, was born in Biarritz. She was a performer at the very café where Basil met Lucian. But the real affair, the one that endangered his commission, was his reputation with Daphne. Daphne stood now, her face pale. He promised it would be forgotten, but it wasn't, Miss Marple said softly. He returned to England. You came later, reinvented, with a fabricated lineage and a carefully adjusted surname. Over time, people believed you were a distant cousin, and you never corrected them. Valerie Luxand. Why would she? Because secrets are dangerous. Miss Craig, especially when one lives in a house where names and titles open doors. Basil let her in, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps affection lingered. But when he decided to name the truth in his will, to finally unearth what he had buried, Daphne couldn't allow it. Martin rose to his feet, horrified. You killed him. Daphne's voice cracked. I didn't mean to. He wasn't supposed to die, just sleep. I slipped something into the brandy, something old. From my father's apothecary case, a powder that dulls the senses. He'd wake, confused. He'd forget this ridiculous business of wills and confessions. Miss Marple's voice, though still calm, now held quiet steel. But his heart could not take it. Daphne sat down heavily, her face hollow. He said he forgave me, that I could stay here as long as I liked, but when I saw him holding that envelope, I knew what was inside. The will, the truth, and if the truth came out, I'd lose everything. Inspector Cray, who had waited just outside with Iris, entered quietly and approached. You heard enough? Miss Marple asked. I did, Cray replied grimly. Miss Green, I'll need you to come with me. Daphne said nothing as she rose, but as she passed Miss Marple, she paused. He wasn't a bad man, she said. He just remembered too much. Miss Marple gave a small nod. Memories can be heavy things, but they are not always ours to carry alone. After she was led away, the remaining guests stood in silence. Lucian wept quietly. Martin looked out the window, shaken, and Valerie, for once, had no words. Miss Marple resumed her seat and picked up the white queen from the board. She turned it in her fingers, thoughtful. The thing about chess, she said softly, is that the queen is the most powerful piece. But once she's gone, the game becomes far more dangerous. She placed the piece back down and folded her hands. There were only 2 moves left. And Miss Marple knew exactly how the endgame would play out. The drawing room had returned to a strange kind of stillness. Not silence, there was the soft murmur of wind at the windows, the distant call of a rook beyond the trees but within Greystone Hall. An undeniable quiet had settled. Like a breath held after confession, Daphne had been taken away without protest. The truth, once hinted at and danced around, had now landed in full heavy, undeniable, and strange in how little it changed the way the house looked. And yet, for those still within it, nothing would ever quite feel the same again. Miss Marple, however, was not content with half a truth. She sat once more by the chessboard. Both pieces, white queen and black knight, before her. Fingertips resting lightly on the edge of the square. She did not yet knit. Her hands were still. Her mind was not. There was one more movement to come. One last question that had not been answered. It came in the form of Valerie Craig. I still don't believe it, the young journalist said quietly. As she took a seat across from Miss Marple, Lady Daphne, the motive fits, yes, but she wasn't the only one with something to lose, or the only one close to him. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed, Valerie leaned in, her eyes sharp. So what are you not saying? Miss Marple smiled faintly, the kind of smile that appeared in teacups and church pews benign, but never empty. Dear Miss Craig, she said softly, you're right. Lady Daphne gave us one answer, but not the full one. She administered something. Yes, something she believed would only cloud the Colonel's thoughts, but what actually killed him was something far more precise. Valerie frowned. You're saying it wasn't the powder? Not entirely. That likely weakened him. But Colonel Arbuthnot didn't simply drift into confusion and never wake up. He died quickly, suddenly. And that's not consistent with Daphne's account, or her intentions. The door creaked behind them. Inspector Cray entered, silent, watchful. Behind him, Martin Lytton hovered at the threshold, looking drawn. Cray folded his arms. You believe someone else finished the job? I believe, Miss Marple said gently, that someone took advantage of Daphne's interference and ensured the Colonel wouldn't live to reveal the final secret. Martin stepped in now, voice unsteady. But why? She already confessed. Yes, Miss Marple said, to her part, but she wasn't the only one in the billiards room that night. The second visit arrived after she'd left. Iris Denby heard a second voice, softer, male, urgent, and that was the final moment. She turned now, not to Martin, but to Quentin Price, who had entered quietly behind them all. You came back through the side gate, she said. Not last night, but the night Basil died. You'd left after the row about the land dispute, hadn't you? But something pulled you back. Quentin froze. You'd seen the revised draft of the will. Miss Marple continued, the one that placed Iris Denby in control of the cottage estate. Not you, not even Martin. And that must have stung. I didn't. Quentin's voice faltered. He changed everything. Yes, said Miss Marple, because he'd learned something, not just about Daphne, but about you, that you had falsified the survey maps in your report, that your advice regarding the boundary dispute was based on manipulated documents. You were poised to benefit from the sale of that land. Inspector Cray's brow furrowed. That's a serious accusation, I believe, said Miss Marple gently, that if you examine the deed files and compare them to the versions Quentin submitted 2 months ago, you'll find the difference. Colonel Arbuthnot must have discovered it after Daphne's confession and before he died. Valerie stepped back. So he was poisoned twice? No, Miss Marple said. Just once. She reached into her handbag and removed a folded handkerchief. From it, she revealed the small cloth bearing the faint silver sheen she had lifted from the cue stick. She handed it to Cray. The Colonel always polished the cue sticks himself. He kept them spotless, but the stick nearest him had a fine dust. Residue from gloves that had recently handled powdered digitalis, a powerful heart depressant. Martin gasped. You mean he handled the poison? No, Miss Marple said. He didn't. It was applied to the end of the cue stick. Whoever prepared the stick knew Basil would lean on it. He always did, right before settling into his seat with a brandy. Skin contact with the palm absorbed directly. That's why the death was so sudden. Why there was no trace in the brandy itself. She turned back to Quentin. You timed it carefully. You saw Daphne leave. You returned. You watched him slump into the chair. And you wiped the handle before disappearing out the side path. Quentin's jaw worked as though words were trying to escape, but none came. Cray stepped forward. Do you deny it? There was a long pause. Quentin looked at the chessboard, at the Black Knight. He said I was like a son, he murmured. But sons don't get cut out of wills. Sons don't get treated like strangers, he threatened. To expose me to the law society. Said I was a disgrace to the family name. but he was the one who had something to hide. Miss Marple didn't flinch, and now she said softly, "You've ensured that no one will ever believe him again." Cray took him by the arm, gently, almost with pity. "Let's go." After they left, only Valerie and Martin remained. The sun had begun to pierce through the clouds, its light stretched across the chessboard, illuminating the queen. Valerie exhaled. So, it was both of them. Miss Marple nodded, to people, to separate motives, and yet they never spoke. One tried to confuse him. The other ensured he never had the chance to recover. In their minds, it wasn't murder, just prevention. Martin sat quiet. He kept saying the past would catch up. "I didn't know he meant this." Miss Marple rose slowly, gathering her things. "The past always catches up," she said gently. "The question is only who it finds first." As she walked from the room, the queen and knight remained on the board, one chipped, one carved in silence, together again. But the game, at last, was over. A week later, Greystone Hall stood as it always had, tall and still among the oaks. Its stone walls weathered but stately, the ivy creeping quietly along its eastern facade. The front path had been swept clean, the garden restored to its pre-storm order, and the air around the estate had returned to the soft quiet that villagers mistake for peace. But inside, the silence was of a different kind. Miss Marple remained at the hall for 2 more days after the arrests. Not out of necessity. Inspector Cray had made it clear her help was no longer required, but out of something closer to courtesy. The household was bruised, and she, like any skilled gardener, knew that some blooms needed tending even after the storm had passed. Martin Lytton was the first to emerge from the emotional wreckage. He mourning after Quentin's confession. He approached Miss Marple with a bundle of old documents under his arm and an expression that no longer held fear, only sadness. "I found the original land surveys," he said. "They were in Basille's filing cabinet, right where he left them, the genuine ones, not the doctored versions Price submitted. He wasn't just dishonest, he was clever about it." Miss Marple examined the papers, nodding slowly. "It's a relief to know Basil was right to be suspicious," Martin added. "He knew something was wrong. I only wish he'd trusted me enough to say so." "He may have," Miss Marple replied gently, in his own way. "But when one has been betrayed often, even trust can look like risk." Martin sat back. "The hall feels different now." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Houses do, after death, especially after secrets." By Thursday afternoon, Valerie Craig prepared to leave. She had booked the early train to London, and her bag sat waiting by the front steps. Before she departed, she found Miss Marple once more in the drawing-room alone, restoring a broken thread in her cardigan with the patient precision of someone who understood that most things could be mended if one only knew how. "I suppose this won't make it into the papers," Valerie said, her tone quiet but composed. "The family's influence will keep it buried, won't it?" Miss Marple looked up with a small smile. "Likely. But that isn't always a tragedy. Sometimes discretion is kinder than truth." Valerie nodded. "Still, it's hard to accept that someone like Basil could be undone not by war or scandal, but by two people who once claimed to love him." Miss Marple resumed her stitching. "It's often not hatred that kills, my dear, but fear, and the desperate hope that the past might stay where we left it." Valerie hesitated. "You never did tell me how you knew it wasn't over." After Daphne confessed, Miss Marple paused, then looked up. She said she only meant to confuse him, yet the death was sudden, clean, and I had seen the Q-stick polished, yet coated in powder to fine for chalk. I watched Quentin's hands. One nail was hastily trimmed, the sort of imperfection only guilt leaves behind. Valerie gave a soft laugh. "You really do notice everything." Miss Marple gave a modest shrug. Old habits, you see, observation is like a kettle left on the stove. It whistles when something's off. Valley leaned forward. And what will you do now? Oh, Miss Marple said, rising slowly. I'll return to St. Mary Mead. There's a hedgerow I promised to prune, and the vicar's niece is hosting a bake sale. Quite enough excitement for one lifetime, I think. They shared a look not quite warm, not quite formal, but respectful. Valerie picked up her bag and left without further word by late afternoon. Only Iris Denby remained on the household staff. The others had departed under the quiet directive of the family solicitor, who had arrived days earlier to begin the delicate task of handling Colonel Arbuthnot's estate. Iris found Miss Marple in the small reading nook overlooking the West Garden, sipping tea and reading a well-thumbed copy of Persuasion. I just wanted to say, Iris began, voice low, thank you. For seeing what others couldn't, Miss Marple smiled. It's rarely a matter of seeing more, only by noticing what others dismiss. He was good to me, Iris said softly. Whatever else Basil did, he treated me with dignity. I never thought I'd be named in his will. And I certainly never thought it would cost him his life. Miss Marple reached out and gently touched her hand. It didn't, she said. People make their choices. Basil made his, and so did the others. But that doesn't mean their darkness belongs to you. Iris nodded, through her eyes filled slightly. Miss Marple watched her go. That evening, as the sun slid low and gold across the manicured lawns, Miss Marple walked once more into the billiards room. It had been closed off since the investigation, yet the door opened easily under her hand. The scent of wood polish still lingered. The cues were neatly stacked. The balls had been returned to their case. She approached the chessboard still resting on the corner table. The queen and knight remained as she had left them. She picked them up, one in each hand, and studied them. The queen cracked, powerful, and once feared. The knight is loyal, always circling, never in a straight line. She placed them gently back in the box and shut the lid. Then, turning slowly, she left the room. The next morning, she boarded the train to St. Mary Mead. As the countryside blurred past the window, she allowed herself the smallest of sighs. Another game played, another ending written, and yet, even as the train rattled on, Miss Marple knew the truth. The world never stopped spinning. Even in quiet villages, even in stately halls, human nature with all its pride, its wounds, its secrets would always give rise to questions. And Miss Marple, in her quiet way, would always be there to answer them.